will have this conversation today. And like I said earlier on, Izuchukwu Oboko, legal practitioner and public affairs analyst, is our guest today. Thank you so much, Izuchukwu, for joining us this morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
All right.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure to have you. Now, let's begin, yeah? What are the most significant systemic barriers in Nigeria that hinder social and economic development? For starters.
The most significant, some of which you have mentioned in the course of your introduction. Infrastructure is one of them, which also, in some instances, spirals into the education sector, right? Because as much as there are a deficit of infrastructure across the country, infrastructural facilities across the country, the education sector, the health sector is also affected, among other sectors that are also affected.
All right, that's a good one. So,
I hope you can still hear me.
Absolutely.
Yes.
A follow-up to that question now before Sarah comes in now. How can policy reform effectively address these issues you just mentioned?
Yes, the only way forward is to continue to improve on the ways we do things. A philosopher once said that an unexamined life is not worth living. So policy reform is one step in a good direction. In other words, we have an existing system or existing policy, and there is need to make changes to it from time to time. There can be no other ways. That is why one of the very fundamental elements of law and policies is that they get to be abolished, they get to be reenacted, they get to be amended. That is why today we have up to the 5th alteration, in other words, amendment to the Constitution. So there's been first, there's been second, because the society continues to grow. New things happen, and as they happen, so must our laws and policies be amended to reflect the reality of the times we live in. So policy reform is a very, very critical aspect of our lives.
Right. These things cannot just go underway without talking about the inclusion of civil society organizations and groups. Now, how do civil society organizations as well as grassroots movements influence the legislative process in Nigeria to drive reforms that could target healthcare, education, as well as good governance?
Yes. Civil society organizations are a very, very key and critical component of policy reforms. In fact, in the past and even at present, they have been behind some of the significant policy changes that we have seen. We have seen civil society organizations mount pressure on relevant government agencies. We have seen civil society organizations grant interviews like I am now, sensitize the public on the ills of certain government policies and the benefit of a new one. Very recently, as recent as maybe 2 or 3 months ago, there was this thing about the Samoa Agreement.
Yeah.
I recall I was here to also talk about it. I remember that Sarah and other civil society organizations have always been at the forefront of a number of issues, including advocacy against human rights violations, among many others. So yes, the civil society organization can mount pressure, they can engage the relevant stakeholders, they can engage in sensitization of the public and the entire citizenry, among other steps that they can take.
Fantastic. When we talk about reforms, it has to do with all facets of our life as a nation. If you remember the time of our former head of state, IBB, Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida, he was advised by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, to really cut things down when it comes to the economy. And then he came up with a structural adjustment program. Nigerians turned it to the stomach adjustment program, SAP. Now, fast forward to 2023, 2024, former President Muhammadu Buhari and now incumbent President Tinubu, where you have the same organization, the IMF, advising the removal of subsidy, which is a major issue in Nigeria right now. Yeah, but let me not put words in your mouth. So this is the question. What role do international partnerships play in shaping reforms aimed at addressing systemic barriers in Nigeria? And how should our leaders take it? Hook, line, and sinker, or with a pinch of salt?
Okay, I think we should look at it this way. You know, there's no, I mean, it's no longer news that the world is gradually becoming one very small village. You know, the concept of globalization, and in our respective families, we are individuals, we have siblings, or there are family members, right? So it is the same thing with a country. A country cannot exist in isolation, right? I mentioned the Samoa Agreement not long ago. This is a group of countries who are affected by the same factors, climate, economic, among many others, coming together to address their collective challenges. Now, under that agreement, certain responsibilities are expected of the countries in furtherance to that agreement. Now, in some instances, when such multilateral treaties are made or reached, right, certain organizations are established to further the objectives. So for organizations like IMF and many others, right, their role is very, very critical because they have the responsibility to ensure, among others, economic stability world over. Because what affects one country of the world, it will affect every other country, because there are citizens from numerous countries who do business in Nigeria, citizens of Nigeria in other countries of the world who do businesses. So international organizations, they are very, very critical in that they are not just there to give policy guidance to countries. They also have responsibility to monitor and evaluate compliance to, if there are international agreements. For instance, let me bring it home. Well, we have the United Nations Declaration on Human and People's Rights. At the African level, we have the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Now, there are organizations that are responsible for monitoring compliance with human rights. Now, we have the ECOWAS Court, who have the responsibility to, among others, ensure compliance and implementation with the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Same way we have our courts, where any individual feels their right has been violated or there is a threat of violating that right, they have a responsibility to approach the courts for redress. Depending on the level, at each of the government entities, there are administrative procedures for addressing these things. But where individuals are not satisfied with administrative solutions, they can approach the court in certain instances. You understand? So the role of international organization is very, very critical in ensuring that systemic barriers are, removed.
Right.
Notable among them is the issue of gender equality. There's been a lot in that gender equality. And very recently, some of us in Africa may not really agree the issue of gender. People, LGBTQ plus, and all of those advocacy going in that direction. You recall that in 2014, Nigeria responded by enacting a same-sex prohibition act, while in other countries of the world, they were receptive. Countries like Canada, I recall very well that President Jonathan was to grant a 2-day state visit to Canada. But because of the quick passage of the Same-Sex Prohibition Act in 2013, the Canadian government cancelled that visit because Nigeria is a state that will not subscribe to same-sex marriage. So these are the things. In some instances, countries agree with international organizations. In some instances, they are at liberty to take different positions. But the role of international organizations cannot be overstated in ensuring that systemic barriers are addressed, because it creates a lot of problems for them. The issue with Nigerians who want to japa through the desert or through the border. You see, when there is this exodus of Nigerians from Nigeria, it creates economic and social problems for the countries where they are emigrating to. Right. And these are some of the issues.
Right. Izuchukwu, that every policy or every reform comes with its own challenges. Sometimes they want to roll out some policies that are for the benefit of Nigerians or the nation at large, but it is met by bottlenecks, it is met by gatekeepers that make it difficult to pull through. So now, what are some of these challenges that are associated with implementing and sustaining policy reforms in Nigeria, and how can these challenges be looked into and properly addressed?
Yes, some of the challenges that can be faced by reform, the key one among them is the political will. Sometimes when the political will is lacking, it is very difficult. It's like, I'm not sure this is an appropriate illustration, but when you take the horse to the stream, you cannot make it drink water except it drinks by itself. That's a pictorial depiction of a lack of political will, what it can do, right? Bureaucracy and red tapeism is one of them. There is a lot of bureaucracy. Some of these are actually designed to ensure balance, to ensure accountability, right? To ensure that there are checks and balances. For instance, when the National Assembly passes a bill, right? One of the ways by which the executive checks them is to ensure that the president assents to such bill. But in certain instances where the president is not assenting and the National Assembly feels very strongly about such bills, there are provisions in the Constitution to bypass the presidential assent to such bills so that they can then become an act, right? So I would say that, and a lot of times too, it is a lack of proper understanding, of what the citizens are going through can also be an issue. When there isn't enough data, or when the data available is not properly analyzed, it can be a problem. You know, very recently, in the view of the minister, the Honorable Minister of Education, he felt very strongly that disallowing students who are less than 18 years from writing WAEC may be a solution of some sort to some of the educational problems that we have, right? I want to believe that the minister may have acted based on the information available to him, or may not have properly analyzed the data available to him in coming to propose that policy. But Nigerians rose up, they opposed it. I believe in the course of granting interviews like this, in the course of writing articles, whether on LinkedIn or several media, right, a lot of people were able to present superior arguments to the Honorable Minister and his team. Then the government saw that, look, it is actually foolhardy for us to embark on a policy like this. So these are some of the reasons why these things can happen. And yes, to ensure that these things don't happen, I think that the will of government needs to be faster. Okay. The pace of decision making needs to be faster. Whatever they need to do, you know, and they still ensure that there are checks and balances and that accountability is also felt. And of course, there has to be political will. That is the key. Once there is a will, they say, there is a way. When there is that lack of will, there's hardly anything that can be done. As beautiful as our electoral act is, and during the last election, we saw how what would ordinarily have been a very transparent process, the presidential election particularly, right, became so opaque, so, you know, was not transparent. And we saw how emotional Nigerians were. You know how beautiful it would be for me to sit in the comfort of my house and then election all over the country. I'm monitoring it through beavers. I'm seeing how things are going. How exactly did the INEC cancel the use of electronic transmission? They said there were glitches. I'm not so sure today if there have been any details attached to those glitches other than there were glitches. What are the nature of these glitches? People are enlightened now. You cannot just wake up and say glitches. What is the nature of the glitch? Right. Is it so substantial that it cannot be resolved? So these are some of the issues. I want to believe that the cancellation of the use of electronic transmission, though an issue for another day, is one of such instances where government has to demonstrate that political will.
You
and
know,
not just engage in a capture or some sort or truncate the process.
so in your last submission, you talked about data, and then you talked about technological advancement when it comes to politics in the country. I don't know if you've seen the dailies this morning, but let me draw your attention to the front page of the Punch, where it talked about the EduGov poll, and it said, major headline, petrol crisis threatens election as APC, PDP prepare for showdown. And this is the rider. This is where I want to draw your attention to. The rider said, INEC transporters review election materials, personnel carriage contract, parties reject last-minute strategies. Why are they doing this? Because they are saying the petrol scarcity might affect transportation of these materials from one place to the other. This is my question to you. How can data-driven insights be utilized to craft more effective legislation that addresses the root causes of inequality and limited access to essential services in the country?
They say that data is everything.
Mm-hmm.
Data is everything. And really, when we say data, we're talking about information.
Yes.
Right? A person's decision cannot be better than the information at their disposal. If I have information that is as recent as 2 weeks ago, and I'm expected to take a decision, right?
Mm-hmm.
My decision cannot be better than the information available at my disposal as at 2 weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
But if I have a more recent information, there is every likelihood that the decision I'm going to be making will be as recent and as effective as the information at my disposal. Now, when I have that information, my own understanding or my ability to digest, understand, and analyze that data at my disposal too is also a factor.
Mm-hmm.
So, in all of this, in any policy reform at all, we cannot understate the importance of data. Data is, I can say, everything, but we know that political will is even the first line of action to even consider any data. So now, in getting that data, government needs to engage relevant stakeholders. When this government came into force, a few weeks after, in fact, it was on the day of inauguration that they announced that subsidy has been removed.
Mm-hmm.
A few weeks after, there was a committee that was set up to look at the impact of the subsidy and propose solution and way forward. Now, when I was talking to a few colleagues about that development, I told them I do not see the honesty on the part of this government. And for whatever it is worth, this is just basic window dressing, just for it not to. Yes, it's a hypocritical move. As we speak and as we are we're having this interview today, what has been the outcome of that committee that was set up by the president? Absolutely nothing came out of it. Nothing effectual came out of it. In fact, the fuel price has even been further increased from then on. One would have expected. Yes, please.
Please land on your thoughts. Just land on your thoughts.
Yes, one would have expected that a very responsible government will, before implementing any policy, do a stakeholder engagement.
Yeah.
Engage with the wide spectrum of people that could be affected before coming out to announce our policy.
Right.
Or having announced the policy, follow through with the committee that has been set up and find a way to implement the recommendations.
I'll take you on the last question based off what you just talked about, stakeholder engagement. Now we're talking about a need for inclusion, carrying everybody along, in quote. Now, what are some of the strategies that can be used to ensure that policy reforms in Nigeria are inclusive and also represent the needs of marginalized and vulnerable communities? You just mentioned stakeholder engagement, which is one of the ways that could have been done. But what are some other strategies? In less than 1 minute, if you can answer that because of our time.
Yes, other strategies that the government can adopt really is sourcing for data and analyzing it properly. Even if it means engaging consultants to do so, they need to do so. And in some instances, they need to do targeted policy reforms. For instance, there's a lot of clamor for gender inclusion in politics, even though I have my reservation about the the view that there has to be a law at all to encourage women to get into politics, right? I have my own reservation about that. But then, these are instances where, to ensure that those who are marginalized or the vulnerable community are included, you need to go down to this community, find out what are the challenges. When you find out, in some instances, for instance, we have the NDDC, Niger Delta Development Commission. We have the Northeast Development Commission. You see, other regions have started clamoring for their own development commissions as well, right? But we see what the NDDC is doing now. Whether they are effective on their mandate is a different ballgame entirely. But to the extent that that commission is essentially for oil-producing states and to address the challenges that arise, that has arisen and may arise from oil exploration in that region. So yes, government can take these targeted steps, in addition to other steps.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Izuchukwu Oboko, and for sharing your thoughts with us on these issues. Thank you so much.
It is always a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Enjoy the rest of
the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.